Welcome back to Be the Change podcast with me, Stephanie Howlett, CEO of Diversity NL. Have a listen as we explore real life, vulnerable topics on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Become awakened, create culture of inclusion, be brave, have impact by being an ally. Explore how you can be the change that you always wanted to be. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Uktamaguk as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We'd like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We open our hearts and minds as we strive for respectful relationships with all First Peoples of this province. We search for collective healing and true reconciliation as we honor this beautiful land together and commit ourselves to being stewards who will respect the cultures, traditions, and ceremonies of all who call it home. Welcome back to Be the Change podcast. We have a very special guest with us today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Manju Varma with us. Just a little bit about you. So for the past 30 years, you've been looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism, especially in the Atlantic region. Good for you, because I can say there's not a lot of people that have had a career as wholesome as that looking at this. I think a lot of things have come to light, potentially since George Floyd was killed in the US. It seems that a lot of anti-racism work and a lot of work in general, maybe it's just, I think, the conversation, right time, right place, that sort of a scenario. So you have your own business, fantastic. Engaging Matters Diversity Consultants. That's amazing, by the way. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And you've hit some milestones in your career. So in October 2021, you're appointed to New Brunswick's Commission on Systemic Racism. So it's the first position of its kind within Canada. And that's kudos to you. And I understand that you've written a fulsome report all about that, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit. And you're currently in a position as Executive Director for Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion for Nova Scotia Community College. Congrats.
Thank you.
So where do you want to start? Tell us maybe a little bit about you and a little bit about your humble beginnings, what that looks like for you.
Actually, it's interesting that you asked me that and you put the word humble, because when I listen to my bio, right, and two things occur to me. First of all, it's way too long. So thank you for just hitting those sort of the highlights. But the second thing is, it makes it sound like it was easy. When we hear people's accomplishments, their milestones, I love that word. It makes it sound like, I don't know, it was smooth running. Or, you went from here and then up to here and up to here, like sort of that climbing that ladder. But it wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. I have worked in the area of diversity and inclusion, anti-racism for the past 30 years, and then have its personal experience as someone living as a visible minority female in Moncton, New Brunswick. I was born in England, but we moved to New Brunswick when I was very young. So I was raised, by immigrant parents and felt as an immigrant myself as well. Sort of learned about Canada with my parents, I guess. But I was working in this area even before I knew I was. I'll give you an example. My very first teaching position was at Allyship, New Brunswick. It's a First Nations community. At the time, it was known as Big Cove, now Allyship. And I had just finished a teaching degree. Never did we talk about teaching children from other cultures. Never did we talk about First Nations communities, even though there are many that surround several large cities in New Brunswick. I was going to St. Thomas University, which is in Fredericton, and it's within, it borders 3 or 4 communities, Indigenous communities, but we never talked about any of that. So my very first job is working at Allyship. I have zero training about Indigenous people. I know nothing about residential schools. So even though I didn't know it at the time, I was working in diversity and inclusion and anti-racism. And, going back to the bio, and it sounded like smooth sailing. That was not smooth sailing. I worked under really, I'm comfortable saying it now, really racist assumptions, very colonial assumptions. For example, when parents would not show up for parent-teacher interviews, in particular for children who really needed parental involvement, I would think like, okay, what's wrong with these people? Why will they not show up? Don't they care about their kids? Because I had zero understanding of residential schools, zero understanding of intergenerational trauma. So even though I had positions where diversity and inclusion was not like written in the job description, it always seemed to be there. I don't know if I brought that lens or if that lens was there and it just needed to be unearthed. So for example, I was at corrections as a parole officer and ended up with many Indigenous and Black offenders on my caseload. Now, is it because somebody saw, oh, there's a brown parole officer, let's give her those caseloads? Or is it something that I said or did that attracted that caseload? I don't know. When I was a conflict mediator for corrections, again, I was like, oh my goodness, like in all these conflicts, there seems to be so many mental health issues, particularly with supervisors who I don't want to say don't know, because you don't know what you don't know, but aren't trained to work with employees who have seen trauma, employees who live under stress, which many employees who work in our judicial system, in our penitentiary systems particularly, have mental health issues. It's a tough place to work. So even, as I said, even when I wasn't thinking about diversity and inclusion as the official part of the position, it felt like I was always working in it. So so that's been like my career. So that's what I talk about when I say I've got 30 years experience. And sometimes it's formal, like being a grant and contribution officer for multiculturalism, Canadian heritage. That's formal. But like I said, being a parole officer or a conflict mediator and saying, oh, you cannot think about values and ethics without thinking about diversity and inclusion. And as you pointed out, yeah, mostly in Atlantic Canada is when I went off to do my PhD in anti-racist education. After a couple of months of reading research, I was like, wait a minute. First of all, most of this research isn't even Canadian. And if it is Canadian, it's about growing up in Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary. I didn't do that. So no one was concerned about, my coming to school and not being able to speak English because I live in an apartment where everybody speaks, Hindi, right? Or no one was concerned about that. No one was concerned about me hanging out with kids that look like me and forming, sort of a gang, because there were no kids that looked like me. So I just realized, like, wait a minute, this is the majority of Canada. The majority of Canada of children who belong to marginalized communities, they're like me. They're one, or a few within the many. They're not these large groups, these large communities that we see in bigger cities. So that's kind of how I ended up where I ended up. And I'm happy I did and loving it now.
Absolutely. But look how one person like you, who looks like you, from a marginalized group, can make so much change and difference in the world.
Thank you.
It's massive. It's massive.
It truly is. The change and difference I've made, you sort of trudge every day.
Yeah. But when you look at it, like, tell us a little bit about the report, and then I want to get into psychological safety. A little bit about the report. What are your takeaways from that report? And then we're going to get into a little bit about psychological safety in workplaces.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned in the intro, in 2021, October 2021, I was appointed as New Brunswick's Commissioner on Systemic Racism. It was a one-year appointment. The appointment was different from other commissioners because there was no office. So whereas other commissioners are meant to take in maybe complaints, like if I look at the Youth and Child Commissioner or the OL Commissioner, they take in complaints, they work with community. Mine was a very researched position. So for a year, I was asked to explore the extent and scope of systemic racism, particularly in New Brunswick. And as you also said, it was the first position of its kind in Canada. So on one hand, I was very honored to have that position. It's a very privileged position. On the other hand, there was nothing to build on, no template, no person to call up and say, hey, you're doing this in BC or Ontario, like, what's it like? It was nothing like that. So I'm a qualitative researcher mainly. So I focus mainly on speaking with people, meeting with groups. In the end, we had nearly 1,000 voices contribute to to our report, either through formal submissions, through anonymous, through people who wanted their name to be on the report, and also organizations. There was some quantitative research added. We did a Likert scale, cold call. We did that through a third party to see what people thought about systemic racism. Is it a priority in New Brunswick? And then we also, through the University of New Brunswick, did a very large scale survey with our leadership at GNB, which would be like supervisors and up. So, a large group. But it was mainly qualitative data. The things I walked away with the most, and I think anyone listening to your podcast, Stephanie, who knows about systemic racism is probably going to say, when I finish the sentence, probably going to say like, duh, no kidding. But so I want to preface it by saying this report is for people who do not think about systemic racism. It was for the province of New Brunswick, the ministers, the deputy ministers, the assistant deputy ministers, the civil servants who do not and have not thought about systemic racism, right? It's not for the people who live it. Because quite frankly, I could have just gone into my basement and written the report because the issues are so obvious to us who live it every day. So what I found is, first of all, the majority of leadership at the government of New Brunswick, because this is about New Brunswick, but I'm going to go on the limb and say I think you'd find similar things in Newfoundland and say in PEI, Nova Scotia, and probably other parts of Canada as well. But the leadership at GNB really does not have a firm understanding on what systemic racism is. So that became very clear. Another thing that became very clear is there is a huge reluctance to keep race-based data. And that is kind of premised on this old idea that if we record race, it's a racist activity. I countered that a lot, especially within health, which I know, that's your expertise. So I would ask things like, well, do you keep race-based data in your emergency room so you know who's being turned away because you think they're drunk and not they're sick, or issues like that? And I always heard, well, no, that would be racist. So a really unclear understanding of why we should be keeping race-based data. And I always just said, like, it's racist if you use that information for racist reasons. Right? If you use that information to make people safer and healthier, then it's not racist, right? It's a tool. So that was another thing. We found issues in sports. We found issues in our education program. At the time, the government in power, which is still the government in power, very fractious relationships with our First Nations communities. So I have huge concerns about that. And yeah, so in the end, we had 86 recommendations that went from 1/3 of which were for our Indigenous communities, but they ranged from, we need to have leadership that understands systemic racism, we need training, we need employment equity strategies, Think of all of the ministers and deputy ministers in the government of New Brunswick, only one self-identifies as non-white. One.
Wow.
That's our
That's
brand.
huge.
Our brand. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do. And unfortunately, last week was our sort of the 6-month anniversary since the Varma report. And there has been very little said or done about it. So I'm sad about that.
So what's one thing from the report that you wish the government would grasp hold to and really implement?
That's a good question. I think I have a tie, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
The tie would be between educate your leaders. So, for example, when you have new ministers, this should be part of the onboarding. They need to understand what systemic racism is because they're signing off on policies, right? Mm-hmm. Educate your deputy ministers who are essentially the CEOs of the departments, and educate your staff. So massive mandatory training, start rolling it out. And I know there are people that have issues with mandatory training and say, oh, well, you know, it doesn't get everybody. Nothing will catch everybody. The people who truly believe that everything is okay right now and truly believe that it works for everyone, it doesn't matter what kind of training you will have, what kind of discussions, you will never catch those people. I want to catch the people who are, you know, that fill that middle ground, who know that our world has changed, who know that we do better with inclusivity, we do better with diversity, and mandatory training catches those people. You know, I worked at a COA, and you know, where you and I first met, and we had mandatory training. We put in mandatory training in a department, which quite frankly, did not have a culture of mandatory training. And when we talked about that, several people said that to me, you know, COA, we don't do mandatory training. I had come from corrections where everything is mandatory training because it's, you know, so many safety issues. We had a 2-year limit that everybody had to take this training. It was 8 hours online, so it wasn't easy, you know, and we also had a 1-year limit for executives. At the end of that 1 year, 98% of the executives had taken the training, and our feedback was incredibly positive. So does mandatory training work? Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's the best system that we have among all of the systems. Because if we wait for people to volunteer, you know who takes those courses? People like you and me, right? Mm-hmm. Or at least we sign up for it and then, you know, we don't go because the day before we're super busy. So we need mandatory training for all levels of leadership. We'd start there and then move into our civil servants. The second thing that is tied with that is establishing a permanent office to deal with systemic racism. As I said earlier, I was a 1-year appointment, but I still get calls, Stephanie. Like I still get people who say, can you help me? This just happened. And it breaks my heart because I have zero influence, right? And so when I do talk to people, I'm like, look, you need to know that I don't have phone numbers. I can't pick up my phone and change this for you. But if you need to tell your story, then yes, I will definitely meet with you. You need to know I'm now the former commissioner on systemic racism. So I think there needs to be a permanent office that can just help people. We're bringing in so many immigrants. I know other provinces are doing the same thing. So many international students. I guess that's the other thing that really bothered me doing this report was how our processes treat human beings, in particular newcomer human beings, whether they come as immigrants or as students. We're treating them like cash cows and not as human beings. And, you know, they're coming with stressors, with the need to feed their children, with the need to have safe homes, safe working places, need to have jobs. And the need for self-realization in their new home. And we don't have processes that allow that. Instead, we have barriers. The processes we do have put up more barriers than life jackets. and that's wrong.
Yeah, a lot to unpack in that, those words that you just laid out for us. I mean, privilege, I think, comes to my mind as a word that we don't often unpack and talk about enough when it comes to the privileges that we all have. And we all know there's lots of different types of privilege. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't have privilege. I worked hard for what I got, but that's not what privilege is about. Some of us have privilege because of the families we're born into, the color of our skin, monetary privilege. There's so many different types, religious privilege. I think just unpacking some of those things for people so you have an understanding of what is it like to walk a day in someone's shoes. If you truly walked in someone else's shoes, that was an immigrant or that was a refugee coming to Canada from a different country, what would that look like for you? I think people would be awfully shocked and taken back about what that looks like for people. Like just
and privilege is a hard word. I'm actually I'm trying to move away from it. Actually, I use with the word safety net right now, and maybe maybe that segues into what you want to talk about, psychological safety. But it's true. People get their backs up when they hear the word privilege. Most of us have worked very hard for what we have, and most of us have, unfortunately, experienced setbacks, whether they're minor or they are on the other end of the spectrum with full trauma, and nobody wants that minimized. So a couple of things I do is I say to people, think of the most difficult situation you ever had, or one of the most difficult situations you had, right? So right away, I'm now the word is escaping me, not justifying, but validating your most difficult experience, right? And so maybe the listeners can do that too, or think about the most difficult experience you've had. Now, take away one privilege that you have and layer that onto that difficulty. So I'm a single mom. I divorced in 2013. It is hard, right? I had to find a new home. I had 2 children. I needed to find a home in the neighborhood so that they wouldn't have to change schools. Get the full dealing with lawyers, dealing with finances, all that was hard. It was not a fun experience, but I had the privilege of a steady job. I had the privilege of a well-paying, steady job. I had the privilege of working in an organization that actually gives you time off for that. So you're not penalized if you have to go see your lawyer. My children were older, so they didn't need childcare. They were able to come home after school. So that's what I try to get people to do is say, okay, think about your most difficult experience. And if you're white, layer race on that. If you're middle class, layer poverty on that. Like, what if I had to go through what I went through and I was poor, right? So it validates your experience, but it also gives you the perspective of how people that don't have the privileges that you did have that experience with, that maybe it was hard to think about because the experience was so awful to start off with, that it's hard to think about like, oh, I have these privileges. But when, in retrospect, think about them, remember how you felt, and now layer a marginalization on top of that. So one of the images I try to share with people is, rather than think about privilege, think about safety net. We all have a safety net, or most of us do. But for some of us, that safety net consists of ropes that are tight, right? Like think of, when the trapeze artist and the safety net underneath. That safety net is there to stop that trapeze artist if he or she falls, right? So it's got the right strength of resilience, it's got the right strength of ropes, and it's got the right size of holes to catch that person safely. We have those safety nets, but for some of us, those ropes are frayed, right? They've been through a lot. For some of us, those holes are big because in some cases, the ropes have broken through. And your safety net might work for you today, but something could happen tomorrow that I might be able to bounce back from, but Stephanie, maybe you can't. So, for example, when COVID happened, the very next day we were told, March, I think it was March 15th, go home, take your laptops home, go home and work. So I'm working, my children are working from home. We have good internet. I'm still getting my salary. Yeah, I'm dealing with, wow, I'm going to be in lockdown for the next couple of weeks with this unknown thing. So I'm dealing with all of that stress, but I'm still getting my work done. My colleague is also dealing with all of that stress. She also has the same privileges of me. She knows she's getting a paycheck. She's safe at home. She has a 2-year-old bouncing on her knee. Now, yesterday, that wasn't, that was okay because you had childcare and you were going to the office. Today, your safety net just got a frayed rope, right? And you don't know how long that rope is going to be frayed. Today, your safety net got a hole bigger or got a hole that wasn't there the day before. So I find when I use those two examples and say, okay, let's not focus on the word privilege. Let's focus on, empathy, I guess, understanding that everybody does not have the same safety net as you, and being able to talk to people like that. So if you and I are having a conversation, Stephanie, and we're talking about different types of privilege that we have, right? Like I could say, well, Stephanie, like you appear as white, so you have that privilege, and and you could come back to me, and next thing we know, we're like in the privilege oppression race, right? Or the oppression Olympics. But if I say to you, this is my safety net, what's your safety net? That's a much different conversation, I think, than let's mix and match our privileges.
Absolutely. I love that. By the way, I've never heard of that analogy, and I hope you don't mind if I use it, because before
I made it up. Go ahead.
No, but I do love it because it I think it brings us to a different place of not comparing us and them, that sort of mentality, which we never want to go to. And Brene Brown talks a lot about sympathy versus empathy, right?
Yes.
Empathy drives your connectedness, where sympathy, it doesn't. It's a disconnect. So I love that piece about, it's empathy. And empathy does drive the connectedness amongst people. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think it also, it drives our allyship.
Mm-hmm.
So I may not know what it's like to walk in your shoes. You don't know what it's like to walk in my shoes, but we've both walked in marginalized shoes, and we know what that's like. I'm just going to open the door for my dog. 1 second.
Absolutely.
He has no respect for podcasts.
All good. I have 2, so I know exactly what it's like. Having pets, and it's okay. That's
you can't read the sticky note I put on the door.
Exactly. I'm at work. Give me an hour. Yeah.
Yes.
For sure. So a little bit about organizations and psychological safety. I think creating inclusive cultures is something that we don't always talk about. And another piece of within that is psychological safety and safe or brave spaces for people.
Yeah. Full disclosure, I've just started to talk about brave space, or actually I've just started to listen about brave spaces. So it's a pretty new concept to me. I like it. I like what I hear. And when I first heard, I was like, wow, I love that. But I'm still pretty new in that discussion. So anything you could share with me would be greatly appreciated. For safe spaces, for many people, that's a pretty new concept as well, especially if you haven't had to think about safe spaces in the past. I know we have 13 psychological factors. I think that works well for people when, when they're doing audits in their workplace, or the checklist people to say, okay, yes, that awareness level. But if we're going to move from awareness to recognition, so another model I use is something called the arc of understanding. And it starts off with awareness. If you picture an arc, awareness, and that's where you kind of you say, okay, I know this is important. I'm hearing this is important, or I'm seeing things I'm not comfortable with. And so it needs, I need to know more about this. Organizations that are at the awareness level might do things like send out pamphlets about this psychological, 13 factors, and or they might maybe celebrate African Heritage Month, their Black History Month, or or have multicultural potlucks. And those things are valuable. They're necessary because they place us into conversations. The next step, which is the R in ARC, so it's ARC. The R is recognition. And you kind of said this just a few minutes ago. You said we don't want to create an us and them, right? And I think a lot of the discussion that we've had around whatever you want to call it, multiculturalism, social cohesion, anti-racism, whatever the word is, anti-discriminatory, inclusion, whatever the term of the day is, it has created an us and them so that some people don't feel like they're part of the conversation. So recognition is about like, you are part of the conversation. Maybe you're part of the conversation because you hold power and you can make change. Or maybe you're part of the conversation for the exact opposite reason. You don't hold power. And we need to find out how to bring you to that place. So I find a lot of people, when I speak to them in organizations, they understand the need, they're at that awareness level, but they don't know where that puts them in the conversation, particularly if they haven't had to think about their safety. I think you can go on YouTube and see this, but I love this video of, I think it's a professor, and he's talking about safety. And he says, you've probably seen this, he says, make a list of what you think about when you're out and you're going to get your car in a car garage and it's night. What would you think about? And the males are like, do I have my keys? Is it raining out? Right? Like, how far is it? They've got like a list of 3 or 4 things. And then the women are everything to like, is my key in my hand, so in case I need to like stick it in someone's eye. Is there lighting? What floor am I on? Who can come with me? What am I wearing? Did I have too many drinks? Like the list is like this, right? And that's, I think, the discussion we need to have around psychological safety, which I'm not hearing as much. Maybe I know it's more in your field, so maybe you are, and I hope you are. But I don't hear it as much at that sort of empathy level or getting beyond yourself level to where does this get into deeper understanding in our workplaces? People tend to focus on physical safety and forget that there is all sorts of other types of safety. So for example, when I meet with organizations and we're talking about this, I'll say, okay, how many of your senior leadership belongs to, outwardly belongs to a marginalized group? So somebody who, is presents as non-white, somebody who presents or speaks about having a disability, somebody who speaks about being part of the 2S LGBT community, so someone is part of these communities. How many of them in your leadership? And often the answer is none. Right. So I said, well, okay, for me, if I worked at your organization, when I think about career advancement, I don't think about safety, or I think about safety because I don't see it. I don't see people like me in leadership. So maybe my career is not going to move here because I don't see evidence that it would. Or if I do get into senior leadership, it's very highly possible that I won't have support. I won't have people who understand the way I think because it's not there already. So I think it's really important that people understand that safety is more than, do I have my hard hat or, this is a scent-free environment. It's far, far more than that. Yeah.
So that C, was that career or is that something else? The ARC, A-R-C. Oh,
sorry. The C is commitment.
Commitment, okay.
So now that you know where your place is, then the next thing is commitment. And what's so important about commitment is that it be within your sphere of influence. So then again, I use examples a lot because I find people really work them. My poor producer, she hears the same examples every time we do. Like, you must be so tired of hearing these stories. A few years ago, there was like this hashtag floating around because the Oscars had just announced their nominees, and they were all white people. There were no non-white people nominated for significant awards. And so there was like this hashtag going around going, you know, all white Oscars, hashtag boycott the Oscars. And by all means, put that on your LinkedIn page, put that on your social media page, bring that awareness. But I don't know anybody that within their sphere of influence can actually influence who gets an Oscar, right? So when we talk about commitment, when I talk about commitment, I'm like, do something that you actually have within your sphere of influence. And if you sit down and think about it, you have multiple spheres of influence. Like you might think, you know what, I'm the admin in a school. I have no sphere of influence. Yes, you do. If you learn to say people's names properly when you're calling for a child over the intercom, okay? If like that's a sphere of influence, that's making real change to that person. And it's also contributing to the workplace because you're saying names are important, right? It's the first thing we get. It's important, and it's important to say them right. So when you go on the intercom and you call a teacher and you say, is Manju, in class, and instead of saying, is Manju, and then the teacher says Manju, which is not how I pronounce my name. Yep, she's here. I'll send her up. Why? Just that little commitment within your sphere of influence. If you coach, if you give lessons, if you're on a board looking around and saying, are there any barriers that are stopping other groups from participating? That's your sphere of influence. And your sphere of influence can be your dinner table. I'm proud to say that both of my kids are very comfortable talking about social justice issues. They make it part of their work. They make it part of their studies because of conversations that we've had around the dinner table. Your sphere of influence is yourself. So a few years ago, I realized that, okay, I might be at the commitment level with diversity in the workplace for visible minorities, but I really know very little about Indigenous women. So I decided that the next 10 books that I read, because I love to read, the next 10 books I was going to read, whether fiction, nonfiction, whatever, was going to be written by Indigenous people in Canada about Indigenous issues. And I did it. I just always made sure that was what guided me in choosing books for the first 10 books. I learned so much, Stephanie, and it didn't involve going to a protest. It didn't involve policy change. It didn't involve, all of those things that we think of that must go into place when we have big change. It just involved me sitting on my couch, January to March, sitting on my couch in front of a fireplace and educating myself, but it was in my sphere of influence. And I was able to educate others, able to bring other thinking to process design, to efficiencies, to change because of taking that time. So yeah, it's A for awareness, R for recognition, knowing your place, and C for commitment. If I did have the image up right now, you'd see they overlap because it's not like pit stops. Like, oh, today I'm at awareness and I'm going to drive to recognition. It's not like that. And also you move on the arc, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I was with corrections, I was an ambassador for Safe Space. And for your listeners who don't know what that is, it is a program within the federal government where we have safe spaces to discuss the issues that are important to the 2S LGBT community. We educate our co-workers, and we create allied spaces. So I was one of the ambassadors for that program, did lots of talks, helped create resource rooms for people to have a safe space. And then I moved departments. I went to ACOA, and I was just so busy learning people's names that there was no time to be an ambassador of anything. So, but a year passes and I'm like, oh, I really should do this again. I miss doing this. Well, now I'm at the awareness level again, right? So I left corrections at the commitment level, but now I'm at the awareness level because I had to learn about how ACOA does this. That's not a bad thing. It's not a lower level. experience. It's oh, okay, I'm learning something new. This is actually good. So one thing when I do talk about the art, like it's okay if you're at awareness, you have to be at awareness first. And it's okay if you go back to awareness, because that actually means you're learning something new. It actually means you're growing. So while it does look like an arc, and I know we all get into that hierarchical thinking, it is important every level. And like Martin Luther King said, the arc to justice, or arc of history, is long, but it points towards justice. So it doesn't matter where you are on that arc, you're moving towards justice.
I love that, because I think we're all learners. We don't all know everything about everything, and getting to know, I call it the historically excluded communities that we're not a part of, getting to know more about them, women,
Yes.
Indigenous, persons with disabilities, 2S LGBTQ, racialized minorities, just getting to know all about the different
Absolutely.
communities. How can we help, right? This is Pride Month.
Yes.
So how can we help, different communities that we are either a part of or not a part of? Like, how do we become allies or accomplices? A friend of mine calls it accomplice, because she says, you're with me, you're in it together. Yes. We're doing the crime. And I said, I love that, because an ally is, you're reaching out, like, how do I help, how to support? But accomplices, we're doing it together. It's almost like a step above the allyship, which, that's, you're putting yourself out there. Right.
That's right. I recently heard that as well. And I said, I love that, because it's like, yes, when the crap hits the fan, because I'll still be here. I won't run away, right? Or I won't be an ally from a distance. Like, I'll be there in the mugshot with you.
100%. And I think that takes a big commitment, I think, from all of us. Because we don't,
there's safety there, like, keep coming back to that, like, these are difficult conversations to have. We all make mistakes. We might use the wrong language. I live in New Brunswick, but I just started working in Nova Scotia. And I remember one of my senior advisors saying, he was talking, and he said, here in the queer community. And I was like, oh, you can't say queer. Like, what are you doing? We're at a meeting. And then, but apparently you can in Nova Scotia. So it's just, you're always learning. But there needs to be safety for that too. Like, if I make a mistake, if I say the wrong thing, then I need to know that I'm in a safe place enough that I'm not going to be, like, oh, we can't talk to that person anymore, or that person's just lost their reputation because they used the wrong terminology. Now, I'm not talking about hateful terminology. I'm just talking about this is again, the arc moves forward. We're continuously on that journey. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to not pass all the tests, and it's important that we have workplaces that are safe, that we feel it's okay to say, I don't really understand that terminology, or I'm not quite sure if that's the right thing to say or do. I need to think about it. It's okay. And we need to have those safe places to be able to do that as well.
Absolutely. So as we're closing, what are some final thoughts around how we can all create safe, brave, psychologically well spaces? I guess that whole well-being.
I guess move to safety first. Again, I think in the past we have focused on, just a second. Oh, goodness. Oh, sorry for that. The dog rules. Move to
all
safety.
Houses.
Yeah, move to safety first. In the past, we've focused on diversity. Like, let's do those check marks. Let's get people in so we have a diverse workplace. It's so easy to do that if you're not the one being put in those places. I always say, create your safe and inclusive places, and the diversity will come, right? So instead of saying, okay, we need to hire somebody from the Black community, we need to hire somebody who is comfortable being out because we need those role models. Create your workplace that's safe. Create workplaces that are inclusive. Because first of all that diversity that you can't see, that people might be hiding, maybe it'll start to come out, right? And maybe your place is far more diverse than you actually realize it is. but word spreads, especially nowadays, with social media, with the way that we talk to each other, with podcasts, word spreads. I know the organizations that I would be safe working at. I know the ones that I would be comfortable, and I know the ones to stay away from. So create inclusive, safe places, and your diversity will come. People will know, and they'll want to come work at your place. They'll want to be part of your spheres of influence, whether it's organizations, whether it's community, community places, whatever, whether it's your home, they'll know. So that's what I try to encourage people to do now. It's like, let's forget about the diversity. That'll happen if you have authentic, safe, and inclusive places.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for today's conversation. It's been very enlightening. If folks want to reach out, how can they get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So I have a business website. It's very easy. It's www.engagingmatters.ca. It's Engaging Matters, all one word. I have my own podcast as well, but it's done now. But it's called Talking Racism. So it was a podcast that I did while I was commissioner, because I wanted to be able to reach out to people in as many different ways as possible. I was new to it, so if anyone listens to it, please be generous with your not comments, but like, it's not my forte. Let's just put it that way. But there's some really, really great guests, like the grandson of Nelson Mandela, Madiba Mandela is on there. A lot of people are first, so some great guests. Listen for them, not so much for me. And also the report for the Commissioner on Systemic Racism is available online. So again, if you just Google New Brunswick Commissioner on Systemic Racism, the report will come up in both official languages.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Stephanie. You too. Yeah, for me as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for being with us today. Comment below, subscribe, connect with me at stephanie@diversitynl.com or on LinkedIn. Be the change.